Hello everyone, I'm Nökkvi from Birds of Play, and in this video I'm going to be sharing with you some of my expectations and first impressions of Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII, the last game in the somewhat controversial, or at least not universally beloved, Final Fantasy XIII trilogy. But just so you can get a feel for where I'm coming from, I'm someone who has really learned to appreciate the original Final Fantasy XIII as well as Final Fantasy XIII-2, even though my initial impression of the original game back when it was released wasn't all that positive. Having just replayed Final Fantasy XIII and XIII-2, however, I can honestly say that I'm really looking forward to playing Lightning Returns and finishing the trilogy, this video being an opportunity for me to document my thoughts on a Final Fantasy game I haven't played yet, which is a pretty rare opportunity in and of itself, but it's also an opportunity for me to share these thoughts with you and to let you be a part of the journey. If you end up liking the video, and if you're ready for more Final Fantasy in your life, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, and joining the Birdhouse. But without further ado, here are my expectations and first impressions of Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII. Starting with my expectations or hopes for this game, going in as blind as I possibly can, there are at least 3 things that come to mind that sort of tie into my prior experience of the trilogy. My first hope being that the myths that underlie and inform everything that has happened so far in the story will be brought properly into the spotlight, and we get a chance to actually become familiar with the gods. In the original Final Fantasy XIII, the fal'Cie served as stand-ins for the gods, so it stands to reason that pushing the fal'Cie to the side would make some more room for the gods to reclaim the center stage. This is sort of what happened in Final Fantasy XIII-2, with the emphasis on the goddess Etro, but even then it felt like the true Final Fantasy XIII mythos was still being kept at arm's length, since we never actually get to meet her. There are of course reasons for this, but it made me start to miss the fal'Cie a bit, since even though they represented a diluted version of divinity, they at least had physical forms and actually interacted with the party. Since Lightning Returns is the last entry in the trilogy, I'm hoping that we're finally going to get to meet our maker or some other gods face to face, or get a proper in-game explanation of how the world came to be. Not that I don't have a general understanding of the lore, it's just that I wish it would also be done justice outside of data logs and other sources. The second thing I'm hoping for is an engaging battle system. I thought they did a great job improving the battle system of the original Final Fantasy XIII for Final Fantasy XIII-2, and would have loved to see a continuation of that, since it's so unique. But I've already heard that the system in Lightning Returns is very different, so all I can hope for now is that it's different in a good way, and also that it retains at least some semblance of the previous system, just so that the trilogy can feel somewhat cohesive. And speaking of a cohesive trilogy, my last hope is that Lightning Returns will stick the landing and bring the story to a satisfying close, deepening my appreciation of the 2 games that came before it instead of undermining it. A lot of people feel like Final Fantasy XIII-2 undermines the original, since the game took the story in a drastically different direction, but I feel like it still extrapolates on the concept of the relationship between humans and the divine. If Lightning Returns continues this tradition, no matter how different its approach might be, I have a feeling I might be up for it. But now that I've outlined my hopes and expectations, I guess it's time to just try playing the game. But don't worry, I'll be back in a few seconds through the power of editing to tell you how I feel about the beginning.
Only 13 days to go.
What are you doing?
It's over. And so I was chosen by God.
Are you alright?
And welcome back. Having now played the first 1.5 hours of the game, I can start to formulate some sort of opinion on it. Firstly, I would like to note that I really like how the story is set up, with Lightning and Snow sort of being on opposing teams, and I'm really looking forward to seeing more of Snow, even though his motivations appear to be a bit transparent. Much like in the case of Caius from Final Fantasy XIII-2, his actions seem to revolve around the fate of the person he cares for most. Although I'm a bit confused as to why he doesn't just team up with Lightning, since her goal seems to be to actually revive Sarah, her younger sister and Snow's former lover. Maybe it has something to do with the Sarah lookalike, and maybe Snow has actually found more important things to protect. But even then, there seems to be a fair amount of self-sacrifice or negation of the self involved, since even though Snow seems to occupy quite a powerful position, he appears quite tragic. But I guess I will have to play more in order to find out. Another thing that I really like was how Lightning seems to have a more direct relationship with divinity this time around, not being a servant of Atro, but rather the main god himself. We haven't met him yet, but I'm assuming that he's going to play a bigger role than Atro did in Final Fantasy XIII too, and I'm excited for that. Moving on to the battle system, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, but like I had heard, it's very different from the previous battle system. You can still stagger enemies, but staggering them seems to obey totally different rules this time around, and if I'm understanding things correctly, each enemy has an individual stagger requirement. I like switching outfits mid-battle, but one thing that struck me was how the battle HUD looks a bit cheap. Maybe I'll get used to it, but my first impression at least is that it looks a bit unpolished, even though it serves its practical function quite well. I like the return of Child Hope, even though it just reaffirms my belief that Hope should have grown even older in Final Fantasy XIII too, in order to add to the mystery and to make the contrast even more stark. Now that I've seen the return of Hope, I'm also hoping we'll get to meet other members of the party, since, at least in the case of Lightning, Snow and Hope, the original Final Fantasy XIII party seems to have stepped up its game in regard to being big players in the mythological tale, which maybe isn't surprising considering everything that's happened to them and how influential they have been. Lastly, I want to talk about my short visit to Loxerion after being reunited with Hope, because that's where the game seems to begin for real. I like the setting of the world and how people have stopped aging and multiplying, but are still able to die, making everyone aware that the world is ending in one form or another. I'm not sure how I feel about the clock mechanic though, since it seems like you have a limited amount of time to finish your missions, and it kinda stresses me out to be honest, instead of just letting me enjoy exploring the world at my own pace. Certain missions are only available at certain times, which makes everything feel like a race against the clock, but I'm willing to give it a chance at least. The most negative thing I can say about the game at the moment, however, is that me and Pétur, he's the Redbird in case you're not up to date on bird terminology, actually got stuck during one of the missions, and that's where our first play session ended. We ended up killing some guys we were supposed to follow discreetly, and we don't know how to make them respawn. I don't want to rely on a guide, but if someone from the community has some ideas, feel free to drop them in a comment down below. And that pretty much does it for my first impression of the game, except maybe that NPCs seem to have some interesting behaviors, sometimes falling down or interacting with other NPCs in strange ways, but that made for some really interesting or funny moments, and I'm hoping to see some more of that in the future. We're going to continue playing even though we currently don't know how to progress in the game. Well, it can't be that hard, but I also wanted to take the opportunity to announce that we're going to be sharing our playthrough here on YouTube. So if you really want to take a ride with us and listen to our thoughts as we play the game for the first time, please keep an eye out for that. But don't worry, we're not turning into a Let's Play channel, and aside from next week, these videos will just be something extra we'll be doing in addition to our regular schedule of Final Fantasy analysis, or whatever it is we do. Thanks for sticking with me all the way to the end, even though the video mostly consisted of me just rambling about how I'm feeling at the moment as I dip my toes into a Final Fantasy game I had previously overlooked. Having made it to the end of such a strange video, my bet is that you are already a subscriber, so instead of spending the end of the video trying to recruit more subscribers into our growing community, I just want to say thank you for giving us a chance and tuning in from time to time. It means a lot and makes it possible for us to continue down this path. Come on now, don't be embarrassed. Join me in making some bird sounds.